Hello, everyone. This is Ed Breniger, and welcome to the Eddie Network podcast. My guest today is Richard Martin, and I know Richard Martin because he is the co-author of this great book with Kenneth Mikkelsen, The Neo-Generalist. And if you have not read this book, you should. I highly recommend it. I am being mercenary in this because I'm one of the stories in the book, but I get no payment from that. I just get to be able to say, listen to Kenneth and Richard because they are wise men who have something to say. So, Richard, thank you for coming on and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do and what your interests are.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. My background is that I was once upon a time an academic in film studies, but what I do today is I'm a writer and an editor. There was a gap in between that where I worked in a variety of different industries, public, private, and non-profit sectors. Lots of work in change leadership, information governance, knowledge management, all of which made me question how our organizations work and whether those disciplines for which I had some responsibility actually were real disciplines at all anyway. So that made me question, doubt, explore. And when I was offered voluntary redundancy from my last job, I grabbed the opportunity because what I really wanted to do was go back to writing and editing, which is something I'd done previously, but with the aim of helping other people. So one of the things that gives me the greatest pleasure is actually helping other people realize their ambitions to create books and to sort their ideas and present them to the world and begin conversations. So that's what I do now.
Yeah, and you do a really fine job with that, and I commend you because it's a very humble role to play where you're helping someone else produce a book that is their book, and it's but you've had a role to play in that. So I commend you for that sort of, shall we call it, a servant leadership mindset that you come to that.
Yes, but there's also, there's something for me in it as well. So every project is an opportunity to learn, and that's what I'm really looking for in what I do. So I found that when I was within industries, I didn't have the passion for the industries. I might be a consumer. So I worked in the health sector, for example, and I worked in the transport sector. I was a consumer of services, but I had no passion for the actual industry itself. Whereas literature of a variety of different forms, I've always had a passion for, and film I have a passion for, and tying the two together is, the whole idea of storytelling. And people are coming to me with projects which are so varied that there's always an opportunity to learn. You'll get something new from every interaction. So I get something out of it, as well as helping somebody else actually realize their ambitions.
Are there ideas or thoughts or concepts that have come from these books that you have helped people write that have stuck with you as like, this is really a significant idea? And when you're talking with someone like me, you're in a pub or someplace, they say, what do you do? Oh, they say, well, what's something that has come from that experience of writing that has stuck with you as really important?
There's certainly certain ideas that stick with me, and there are some experimental ways of examining them. So I think what's really interesting about working in this field is that you get to view certain topics from a perspective that you might not have looked at it from before. So you get your eyes opened up to a different perspective, and that's always really gratifying. But there's certain ideas. So I worked on a book with somebody called Gerald McGrath called In Praise of Disorder. And it's just a subject that I absolutely loved. He'd been influenced by a Japanese author who wrote a book called In Praise of Shadows. So he was looking at the difference between light and dark, and he was talking about pre-war Japanese culture. And what Jerry did was take that idea but apply it to disorder. So disorder actually is a catalyst to creativity, as something that can be a positive rather than a negative, which is often thought of, chaos. But he was also bringing to bear his own experiences as a consultant and as somebody who'd worked in the arts in a variety of different ways and different projects and with different institutions. And he just built this case for disorder, and it's just a brilliant book that he's written. But he's also worked with a really good illustrator as well, so he's made an artifact, not just text that you read on screen. So that's a project that's really stuck with me.
I like that idea. I'm order can take on many forms, and principally I see that as an idea about transition, that we're all in transition. And if and that disorder that comes when transition comes is an opportunity for creativity, and it's a source of energy, I think, for us. So that sounds like a book I need to read. Both of those books, the Japanese book and the one you wrote. So because I think I see that all around us, and I don't think leaders typically have a good grasp on disorder, and they don't even see how their own actions create disorder, and their people don't understand why the disorder has a purpose to it. I mean, it's all. I mean, my mind is just my mind is cranking out all kinds of applications of that simple idea, which is really great. And clearly we live in a time of disorder. We were talking before we went on the show that there's a lot of disorder out there, and
there is. But there's other aspects to it too. So you can think of when we're looking for solutions to problems, or taking advantage of opportunities. In a very ordered world, it's very binary, and you see, I've got two options. Whereas with a more of a disordered perspective, there's multiple options, and sometimes the left field option is the one to go for. Sometimes it's a fusion of the two, and to some extent, that's what Kenneth and I were exploring in Neo-Generalist as well. It's about that. So much of our world at the moment is about binary positions, polarization, whereas actually all the really interesting stuff's that gray area in between.
Yeah.
The poles they're very similar to one another. You certainly see that in politics. You go to the extreme of either, and what you get are ideologues. So whether you got a Liz Truss, who was a conservative ideologue, or a Jeremy Corbyn in this country, who was a left-wing ideologue, you end up with this sort of very rigid position. they're very similar to one another in that way, even though their politics seem to be so diverse. It's just all that nuance in between. That's where all the really interesting stuff is.
So I guess the question is it a good thing to go out and be disruptive?
Of course.
Disorder.
Yeah, of course it is. If you go to order, what happens? Entropy. The system collapses in the end. Yeah, so you need disruption, because that's a catalyst to more energy, and it's a pattern that people like Charles Handy or Jonas Salk or Geoffrey West were talking about as well. So you have that sort of sigmoid curve where things plateau after a period of time. So you might have exponential change and then things plateau. And what they were saying is that you've got to change before you hit the top. You've got to change again. You need disruption to actually evolve. So I think it's a pattern that you see through the history and through evolution, whether it's in the natural world or whether it's evolution of companies or cities or even ourselves in our work, which again was a point Kenneth and I were making in our book, is that if you dig deep into one furrow and become deeply, deeply specialized, there's nothing wrong with that. But there will become a time when you become redundant, irrelevant, because times have moved on. And so it's being adaptable, being able to acquire new skills and do something different and do something different again and do something different again, and combine all of those experiences into an offering that makes you unique. So it's about being able to adapt constantly, disrupting yourself as well as disrupting others.
I had Kenneth on here a few weeks ago, and he made a comment that I thought was really important for understanding what it means to be a Neo-Generalist. He says a Neo-Generalist doesn't mean that you don't specialize in something.
Absolutely not. No, that was the core argument for us. So when we first started talking about the book, Kenneth approached me about initially about helping him edit a book, and then he asked me to co-author a book. And what he wanted to write about originally was a book about generalism. And I started reflecting on it more, and we started having these conversations back and forth. And I'd written a piece about polymathy, and when I started putting that together with what we were talking about generalism, it made me suddenly realize that polymath is just a serial specialist. And so you have to be able to specialize, because to make yourself noticed, sometimes you have to be a specialist in something, or for a period of time, you have to specialize in something. Yeah, you're appointed to a position, you specialize for a period of time. And what Kenneth and I were then exploring is that, okay, we're really interested in this idea of generalism, and we're expanding it, and we're talking about polymathic generalism, but we've got to recognize the importance of specialism. And what we don't want to say is you can't be a specialist. You absolutely can be. And what we were trying to say is that we all have within us, innate within us, the ability to both generalize and specialize. And it tends to be our academic systems that often pushes towards specialism, and then the recruitment process pushes us deeply into specialism. But we have to have the facility to actually step back out again and broaden and change and specialize again, which is why we use the metaphor of the radio frequency as well, the dial. You know, you keep tuning into different frequencies, and that you light on a spot where you might specialize again. And we made reference in this idea of frequency hopping. We made reference to Hedy Lamarr, who was a very famous Hollywood film star, but also was a brilliant scientist, and actually was involved in some of the technology that we now have in, you know, things like Bluetooth, you know, because of the work that she did on sonar. So you know, there was somebody who could dive in, come back out, dive into something else, come back out. You could keep them separate, or you can bring them together. And that's why we had this notion of a continuum, because we were saying, you know, sometimes you'll specialize, sometimes you generalize. One of the things we were trying to flag, though, is that people often talk about the T-shaped person, for example. And we said that comes with a caveat, because a T-shaped person in the workplace tends to be somebody who has been deeply specialized, and then they've been given a manager's hat. That's the T. And they're still in that deep specialism. They haven't actually come back out and found other specialisms to combine. They begin to develop managerial skills, some leadership development skills, but they're not broad. And so we've wanted to flag the fact that we thought the sort of people we were describing were more WWW shaped people. You know, they go up and down, deep and shallow specialisms. Another metaphor people use is the broken comb shaped person. Somebody who has a breadth of skills, some of them very deep, some of them shallow, but they all add to what they can offer in their interactions with others and in their workplace environments.
Yeah, and I, you know, as someone who is a neo-generalist and a polymath, and I've known that since I was in college. Didn't have the language to know that, but I knew that because, you know, I can remember my first semester of university sitting in these classes and thinking, I'm going to spend 4 years studying this one thing. I can't do that. I have to find something bigger. And I ended up as an American Studies major, where I had a really wealth of range of courses that I could take that fit under that umbrella. So that's it. But I think this is also what I've learned, and I think this is important, because most of us have been conditioned and educated to be specialists. We think, therefore, we're not neo-generalists and we're not polymaths. But I think those are behaviors that we can acquire. And so, so we have to say, well, you know, I am, I sell insurance, but I'm going to look and see how all these other fields of business and other fields of excuse me, the social sciences factor into me being able to sell insurance. And where it factors into, it means, oh, I'm going to be able to sell to all these different people because now I have an understanding of who they are as a dentist or as a librarian or as a school teacher. You know, I'm learning all these different fields. I'm learning all these different areas of knowledge, which allows me to enter into a relationship that has a depth to it that grants me a level of credibility with someone who just doesn't see me as an insurance agent, but sees me as someone who is using insurance to serve people in a much more broader sense.
Yeah.
So that, I think that's, you know, that's a message that I like to convey to people, and you can go learn wherever you are, and
Yeah. Well, the thing that I suppose is completely contextual as well. So, you know,
yeah,
we have to adapt to context, and we're constantly subject to change in our organization. So somebody might be, I don't know, they might be a finance executive, but actually then they get involved in change leadership. You know, it's a different kind of skill set. Um, and so they're learning new skills and becoming specialized in another area, and then they're blending those experiences together. And then they might move up into a senior executive position. They might become the chief executive officer. So again, they have completely different requirements and skills there. And often, you know, this was something that came through one of the interviews in the book as well. This idea of the general. You know, that you go up the hierarchy, and the general is actually generalized. It's not that they have all the knowledge about one particular thing. They have to have a breadth of knowledge
right.
and be able to enable the people for whom they're responsible to lead and be the experts in their fields. And you can then apply that, take that idea from the military, apply it to organizations, apply it to politics, whether you've got the prime minister, a general, a CEO. They're very, very multidisciplinary. They have to be.
So where do you let's take this. I'm taking the idea of the neo-generalist as a powerful idea that is for our time. So I'm already convinced. So, but how should we? I'm searching for the right way to ask this question, because what I see is that the world is not oriented towards the neo-generalists, but it needs to be. So how do we help organizations make that shift? Any ideas?
Some of it's language.
Okay.
So I'm thinking of a book that came out after ours. There's a book called Range by David Epstein. Really interesting book, some very, very interesting science-based ideas in it. But look at the language he uses. His subtitle is something about how generalists can succeed in a specialized world. So he's continuing notions of polarization. And so, you know, so it's a specialized world, a generalist succeeding in it, rather than bringing the two together, which is what we were trying to do. I think our language of business is appalling. I've just been subjected to it, you know, for so many years, and I felt so dehumanized by it. You know, I'm not a resource. I'm not capital. I don't want to be calibrated. I'm not waiting for Charlie Chaplin's spanner to come and work on me. So I think, you know, the humanization of people and the recognition of their ability to adapt, to change, demonstrations of care, that the connections of time as well. This is a really important point for me about time, and we touch on it in our chapter about leadership in the book, because I think a lot of our modern businesses are so focused on now and not about the past or the future, that they are so short-termist that they fail to see people as people. They fail to connect sort of the legacy. So this notion of being a good descendant and a good ancestor, that they miss that part of things, about the connectivity of time about serving the future as well as respecting the past. So I think it's becoming more part of the language now, because people are being made aware of the future because of the whole green agenda, and the need for organizations to actually meet certain designated targets. But there's a bigger piece here, which is about reconnecting to indigenous thinking, which was shunted aside, sort of, certainly with the Enlightenment. So I think that we've got ideas in our businesses now that are a legacy of the Enlightenment, scientific revolution, industrial revolution, where separations introduced. Man separated from nature, man separated from man. Our senses are separated from our minds, and that continues through the workplace until we become these functions, these little parts on a conveyor belt, either literal or metaphoric. And so this is one of the reasons why we end up with specialism, because we're all just micro functions, and that's how we're perceived, and we're replaceable. And that people have lost sight of the sort of the whole. And I think that holistic perspective that not only sees the whole of the organization, how things work, but what people do and how it connects to the future. I think all that is missing, both in the behavior and in the language of how our organizations function. That's a really long-winded way of responding to your question. I'm not even sure I have responded to it, but it's just some of the things that really.
I think you've pointed to several things that I think are really valuable for people to wrestle with. And I think it's the mechanistic structure of business, society. I mean, we're all components in a large machine. We are treated as consumers because that's a way that we can be controlled.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so I think, I mean, at the beginning of your answer or your description, you spoke about the importance of humanity, and I think that's where we begin, and we recognize the inherent value and dignity of each individual, regardless of who they are. And then we have to talk about, so what does it mean for us as a society to be in relationship to each other?
Absolutely. And relationships, something you really focused on in your own book. So relationships between people, between ideas. I would add this dimension of relationships between times as well. And I think it's absolutely essential that as we evolve, if we evolve beyond the calamities of our climate crisis, then we have various relationships that are between humans, but there's also between the human and the non-human. And I think we're beginning to recognize that again. And that's what I mean by saying indigenous thinking is beginning to re-emerge in discussions about leadership. And also we've got the relationships with non-human in terms of technology too. So that's another aspect that, whether that's AI or robotics or just us working with this, the way we are all hybrids now, the way we're all constantly connected to devices, and that's some of our knowledge is outsourced to those. But I think there's aspects of time that I want to touch on too, because when I stopped being a commuter and started working from home, I really noticed a different appreciation of time in what I was doing, and I wrote about it, sort of looking at the film Arrival and looking at Aldous Huxley's novel Brave New World, because I was made aware of these sort of ancient Greek distinctions between chronological and chirological time. So chronological, sequential, chirological, more about the opportune moment, and it made me think about sort of quantity, which is what our organizations are so obsessed with, post-industrial organizations, versus quality. And I could see chirological time as an aspect of, quality, the quality use of time. But I I was also thinking about how chronological time, as it's come through from the church, call to prayer, and then industrialization, the work clock became a mechanism for control too. And chirological time was a way of getting out of it. And it's a bit like Csikszentmihalyi's notion of flow as well. So I found that when I was at home and then just involved in work, I just sort of slipped into that chirological time in that I was writing, I was editing, and I had no sense of the clock really at all. And it was only as my family came back home that I got back into chronological time. You start have social duties, you've got dinner to make, I've got dad taxi services to do, whatever. And I used to have that all the time because I was a commuter and I had to catch a train at a certain time. I had to be in the office at a certain time. I had a diary that was crammed full of meaningless meetings. So using those experiences and then looking at something like the film Arrival, which plays with time because it uses language in a really interesting way. So have you seen it, Arrival, or read the shorts? Yeah. So this notion of the aliens coming down and slowly learning how to communicate with them, and they use ideograms, which actually are complete paragraphs. They're not a word; they're paragraphs of text, and they span time. And once you're able to read their language, you actually are able to time travel. You can see into the future, you can see into the past. And then I looked at Aldous Huxley's book, and there you have Fordism taken to an extreme. Fordism basically is society where the human is a disposable part. Not only that, the human is basically a battery. They have a lifespan and then they get recycled. And pleasure is something that's timetabled and chemically induced. And it made me think, well, sometimes I felt like that in the workplace. I just you just felt so controlled to that degree, and that you felt completely dehumanized. Those these temporal aspects of dehumanization I felt really interesting. What I also reflected on though, for these thinking about time, was that there's something relational about time. So when I came back into chronological time when I was working at home, there was a relational aspect. I had a call like this. I had a call, and that pulled me into conversation. So chronological time could serve a useful purpose. It wasn't necessarily harmful. It could be a good thing. It was a connective, in the same way that ideas are connective and conversations connective. So I just had all these weird ideas about time that I keep coming back to, and in some senses, what we discussed in the book was a sort of a trigger for some of these further reflections. And you talked about servant leadership, and we got this notion of leadership as a stewardship. So you're caring not only for the people now, but for people in the future. And there's that whole notion of cathedral thinking that Charles Handy talks about a lot, but more recently Greta Thunberg has as well. Cathedral thinking, the idea of working on something that you're not likely to see the end of. You're contributing to its creation, but you may not derive the benefits of it. But your children might, or your grandchildren might, and so there's still a purpose to what you're doing. There's still something that connects you to it, and there's another aspect of the relational side of things there.
I like that. I like that very much. And I'm, I was raised in a family where we were very reflective of previous generations and their stories. And, we've, tracking the ancestral lineage and trying to understand what was going on in their lives. My father's family came over from Germany in 1730. Some of my mother's family came over in 1750, came over from Scotland. And there's enough record keeping to be able to know where they lived and what happened, and to find meaning in that. And it's the recognition that we are not alone in time, and that we are in a sense the caretakers or the carekeepers of past generations, and we're going to hand off to future generations the same sort of thing. And the question is, what are we handing off? What is it that we have created? And I think that when this kind of industrialized mindset about humanity and society really took root, it was very devastating to many families and many communities, because all of a sudden they were rooted out of what they had known. I think you used the term indigenous, an indigenous pre-modern world. I was writing the other day, and I'm going to use a clip from John Ford's "How Green Was My Valley," which is a movie about Welsh miners and the community of Welsh miners. And my family weren't miners, but it's very reflective of what my family was like. And I think how does it that we have lost that? Because I think there's a sense of loss in that. I meet people all the time young people all the time who say, well, I'm not going to have children. Why would I want to bring children into this world? I said, well, because you see the problems with the world. We need people who actually have children who will change that. So I think this is part of this disruption of time. We're in the midst of this disruption of time, and that the recovery of time, where it has meaning and it has something that allows for us to sustain some quality of life into the next generations. I think, you use the cathedral image. I think the other image is that of, wisdom is, I'm butchering this concept, but you'll be familiar with it. The wise person is the person who plants a seed for a tree that he will never sit under the shade of. That's the long view. Mm-hmm. And that kind of long-term view, and this is what I've seen in organizations. And I saw this in particular working with a large global corporation several years ago. I was doing some webinar stuff, and I had a great time with them. And at one point I went to where their location was, and I got to meet some of the people in person. And I realized there, it confirmed something I'd already known, but it really confirmed that the people who are in the upper echelon of a corporation, whether that's a business corporation or a government corporation, are short-termers. And the middle managers and the workers are long-termers, because the people at the bottom and the lower echelons, they don't have the wealth of the connections to make rapid changes in their financial and their locational prospects. They have to stick with something and work it through, and maybe a new opportunity comes along, but for the vast majority of them, it doesn't come along, and so they have to stick with it. And so what ends up happening is that they see this disparity between the upper level and these lower levels, and out of that develops a culture that I call is a persistent residual culture of values. And it persists because it resides in their relationships. And that seeing that and never seeing it featured in anywhere. It never gets talked about anywhere, because all the attention, in the business press and the business schools, it's all up here at the C-suite level. And all these people down here don't get any attention, but they are creating a solid culture of sustainability and resiliency without even having that intention. They just do it because this is what is necessary to do their job and make their work function for the whole.
Now, I've always felt that a good leader is somebody who actually enables others to take on leadership roles. So that the ultimate aim of a good leader actually should be to make themselves redundant, so that all those people you're describing at middle level, they could run that company without that. Secret. Because if they're given the opportunity to actually have a say, to make decisions, to be responsible, to have accountability, all those things. Whereas there still is a tendency in our modern organizations to divide and conquer, to keep separate. You stay in your corner so that you don't get that interaction, cross-company interaction, and the sharing of ideas. I mean, I'm being very generalized. Of course, there are companies that do that, but
Yeah, sure.
some of my personal experiences have not been like that at all. And where I have had responsibility for certain things, and I've tried to allow others to, I'm perceived as somebody who's not doing my job because I'm actually giving the space to others to step up.
Yeah,
I'm being lazy, and I found that really frustrating because you're actually trying to seed and help people flourish and take on responsibility, so you don't need to be there anymore. That should be the ultimate aim. But
isn't that interesting?
anyway,
It's very interesting. Yeah. Well, I now say that the principal reason that someone should be hired as the CEO is that they know how to facilitate the leadership of everyone else in the organization. And most of them don't even know what that means. And but I think that's where we are, and that'll create longevity and progress and success and growth, and it'll mean that they won't find themselves bogged down by non-essential projects, the things, vanity projects that often get trapped, into the system. So, well, I think it's very interesting. It's very interesting to contemplate what the Neo-Generalist book has fostered, and I think that it's, in many respects, it was written for this time now, and I think I do recommend people read it. I am finding that people are contacting me because they have read my story in the book, and they want to connect, and they want to connect with people who they associate with being somebody that you all created an image of. And I don't know if I am that person, but I seek to be that person. I seek to be the person that you all celebrated in the book. And I think that therefore what you have created is greater than the sum of its parts, and will have greater impact 10 years from now than it even has now, because it will become one of those books that people identify. I read that, or I saw that, and I realized it was saying something about me that no one had ever said it about. And I realized that that's who I am, and that's who I wanted to be. And so I want to thank you for including me in it, but thank you even more for you two writing the book and presenting that to the world, because I think it really is valuable.
Thank you. I mean, as with all books, it was a snapshot in time. And I think it's really important that the book is intended to open up rather than close down conversation. So that's where our thinking was then. And I'm sure that if Kenneth and I would sit down and write that book today, we'd probably write a different book.
Yeah, you would.
Your ideas move on, don't they? But yes, the important thing is that a book fosters conversation, that people grapple with the ideas, whether they agree with them or not. And there are a lot of people who really hate the book, that hate the ideas in the book. And that's fine. At least they've engaged with the ideas. But there are a lot of people we've encountered too who have said words similar to what you said. I recognize myself. And the thing we struggled with, though, is that we gave a label. and actually, we're sort of against labels. That was the point we were making, that people, it's so dangerous getting labeled in the workplace, because then people refuse to remove that label from you. You become that thing. So you become the specialist in a particular area, because that's how people see you. That's just, it sticks, and it's really hard to shift people's perspectives about you. And we came up with this word, and yeah, I don't know. I have some misgivings about it, but there was a bit of play in there too. So I don't know if we ever told the story about how the word came up, but we'd been talking about this whole idea about generalists, and we didn't want to talk about generalists as the counterpart of specialists. We wanted something more encompassing, and we came out with neo-generalist, but then we were able to sort of spin it as well. So Kenneth had recently written a post that used the Matrix, the idea of the red pill and the blue pill, and the lead character in the Matrix is Neo. And the first book I wrote was actually about neo-noir. So we just took that word neo, and it fitted perfectly with neo-generalist. But it stuck, and people have latched onto it, and it's a label I'm slightly uncomfortable about, but it works. So
I think it's good for you to be uncomfortable with it. So because I think all labels should create discomfort. I don't like labels, but there's some that are evocative and some that are aspirational. And I think this is an aspirational one. So if you seek to live up to being a neo-generalist, it'll change how you look at yourself and look at the world. And for that reason, I think it's okay. It'll work. It'll work until there's another word.
You'll forgive us.
No, there's no need to forgive you, because I'm grateful for it. I don't really use the word at all, but because I don't like labels, because I see labels as marginalizing people, and so it dehumanizes them. So, but in this case, I think it's evocative and aspirational and worthy of people connecting to. So Richard, you're writing books, and it sounds like you write a lot of books on leadership, and so if
I edit quite a few books on leadership. I've ghostwritten a few as well. So I've written, I think it's ghostwritten 4 books since the Neo-Generalist, and then edited lots of others. And sometimes it's editing the whole book, and sometimes it's more just being a mentor or helping somebody make a start. It just varies.
So if people wanted to find you, there's a lot more we could talk about, but I think this has been really good for today. But if they want to find you, how would they do that?
The best place is on my website. So it's richardmartinwriter.com. That's the best way. They can find me on LinkedIn. I am present on some of the other social media sites, but I don't really use them. I'm one of these people who switches between tolerating and hating social media. It makes me very, very uncomfortable. So I think the website is the best place to start, because you'll get access to an email address there and a link to LinkedIn as well, if people need to. If they're interested in looking for somebody to help them on a book project, whatever, that's probably the best starting point. That'd
be great to help people find you in that regard. Okay. Well, thank you, Richard. This has been fun, and I'd like to do this again. I want to talk about Peloton at some point, which is a metaphor for leadership that he has created, which is really quite fascinating. It's really, but maybe we'll do that in July, and we'll do it in context.
Sure. And if anybody's interested, I gathered, it starts off as a series of blog posts and an interview and an article, and I just gathered them all together in a PDF, so they're all available to download off my website anyway.
Okay. Well, we'll I'll make sure we link to that particular piece of work that you've done, and we'll put the others in there as well. Thank you, Richard. And thank you, everybody, for watching. Please like and subscribe, and if you got something to say, share your comment or question, and we'd love to interact with you, because that's what we're trying to do here. So until next time, thank you for watching the Eddy Network podcast, and We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.